Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our program, Energy Storage Permitting and Permit by Rule PBR Regulations of Virginia. My name is Brad Nowak. I'm partner and co-chair of the Renewable Energy Practice Group at Williams Mullen. Our renewable energy team has over 30 attorneys in 7 offices in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina who work on practically all aspects of solar, energy storage, and other renewable energy development and other matters. I'm very pleased to be joined by my colleague, Bob Riley. Bob is an energy partner and co-chair of the firm's solar and energy storage team. We are both based in Tysons, but today we're very glad to be in person in our Richmond office. And also joining us today is our special guest, Susan Tripp. Ms. Tripp is the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality Small Renewable Energy PBR Program Guidance and Regulation Coordinator. She has worked for the Department of Environmental Quality for the past 10 years in their central office in downtown Richmond. She started as a data analyst in the air permitting program and recently transitioned to the Renewable Energy Permit by Rule program as the PBR coordinator. Before we kick off today's program, I have just a few housekeeping items to go over. At any point during today's presentation, you may submit questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer questions at the end of the presentation, time permitting. If you're having any audio or technical problems, please use that same Q&A button and someone will help get those resolved. Finally, you'll receive a copy of today's PowerPoint following the webinar. Today's program is part of our 5-part energy and solar webinar series. Our first 3 webinars were held over the last few months. If you missed any of those programs, they're on our website at our solar resources page. We will have our final webinar on June 2nd. My land use partner, Steve Romine, will be covering siting agreements and land use. So if you're interested in learning more about those agreements or zoning process in Virginia, please feel to join us for that program. We have a lot to get to today, so let me pass off the program to Bob, who will kick us off by doing a roadmap of today's program and begin with his presentation.
Thank you, Brad. I appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. Appreciate it and welcome. Just a quick roadmap. We're going to start with a quick overview of the statute. Then we're going to move to a review of the State Corporation Commission storage rules and the program. And then we're going to hand it over to Susan to talk about the VDEQ PBR. So again, please submit your questions as we talk. We'll be trying to get to those at the end of the session as we can. And we'll answer some of those also at the end of the program, after the program, once we get there. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to start first with the statute, just a brief overview of the statute. And then I will talk about the regs, and then I'm going to pass it to Susan. So in 2020, the General Assembly passed the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which requires Appalachian Power Company and Dominion, Virginia Electric and Power Company, to petition the State Corporation Commission for approval to construct 400 megawatts of storage, that's, APCO's number, and 2,700 megawatts, which is Dominion's number, of new utility-owned energy storage resources by the year 2035. The specific code is 585.5E, and we won't detail that specifics of the code. But the takeaway is that no single energy storage project for Dominion or APCO can exceed 500 megawatts, except Dominion is authorized to have a single energy storage project of up to 800 megawatts. Importantly, though, all energy storage projects procured are to meet the procurement competitive protocols in the code, which is 585.5D3. And as many of you on this webinar probably know, each of Dominion and APCO have issued several RFPs that include storage to date. Importantly, third-party facilities, at least 35% of the energy storage facilities placed in service by Dominion or APCO must be purchased by the utility from a party other than the utility or owned by a party other than APCO or Dominion, with the capacity from such storage facility being sold to the utility. And the 35% threshold applies to each interim target number. The SEC went through quite a process that began in the summer of 21, last summer, took about 6 months, and there was a lot of participation in comments on proposed rules that the SEC issued effective January 1 of last year. Importantly, and this is a distinction that you should keep in mind, is that the SEC storage definition talks about energy storage as any technology. So it's not limited to a specific kind of technology, but it's broad. It includes everything. And then it talks about the energy storage facility, which means basically your storage resource and equipment, but does not include a transmission line or a distribution line. I think those are two important distinctions. We won't spend time on it now, but just note that. What is required at the State Corporation Commission? Now, the commission wrote their rules, of course, before DEQ had authority to issue the PBR. So the rules would mandate that if you have 1 megawatt or greater of storage, you need to go to the commission. That's been changed since the regs were issued in 2021, and we'll let Susan talk about that in a minute. But the concept is, if you go to the commission, and you still can, in some cases you have to, you can obtain either a permit or a certificate of public convenience and necessity pursuant to 56-580D. If you have to go to the commission and you're below 1 megawatt, you just have to submit a letter. Again, that's if you're not subject to the DEQ's jurisdiction. Now, the SEC, in order to approve a permit, looked into, in the 6-month process I mentioned earlier, tried to structure their permitting and certificate process based on what they'd done in the past. So what they decided to do was that storage, like generation, actually injects power onto the grid. So because of that, the commission's permitting process that they established for storage is very similar to their 580D process for certificates of non-storage facilities, if you're familiar with that. And it's also very similar to the guidelines that are applicable to solar and wind facilities if you participate in the commission's pilot program for third-party PPAs. The commission also indicated that as they gathered more experience, they may consider streamlining some of the permit requirements or changing them to accommodate storage, but that has not happened yet. So the commission requires 3 issues to get your permit, and they're listed on the screen here. The first one is you have to prove no material adverse effect upon reliability of electric service provided by any regulated public utility. Now, that is also the exact same requirement included in 580D for generation facilities. So it's the identical obligation to prove that issue. And many of these projects will be certified through PJM or NERC, going through a reliability engineering studies. What the commission has verified in some of their comments by staff is that the PJM and NERC reliability studies are important, but that deals with the bulk power grid, and the commission is concerned with the distribution grid. So the commission may indeed go forward and do a separate power flow study to make sure that the storage facility does not in any way provide any material adverse effect upon a regulated utility service. All right, the second issue the commission will require is they have to have a finding that the project does not adversely impact any goal established by the Virginia Environmental Justice Act. And as we know, the state of Virginia has put that as an important milestone. The third item that they look at is that you have to show that you are not contrary to the public interest. And again, that's right out of 580D. So it's very similar to what the commission has done in the past in their generation facility review. Here are the 17 criteria that you would need to file for a permit at the commission. I won't go through all of these. Obviously, some are self-explanatory, others are not. There's a couple here, I think, which I wanted to stop and talk briefly. Number 11 is an environmental impact analyses. And I think since Susan here, it's important to show that even if you go to the State Corporation Commission for your storage, the DEQ will play a very important role. There's a memo of understanding between DEQ and the commission that the commission will use for wetlands and other environmental issues. So the DEQ will actually put together a very intense study and submit it in the record for the storage facility application itself. So now, House Bill 2148 came in and they changed the statute, as we know, to include storage as a small renewable energy project. I'll quickly say that the energy storage facility that is applicable to DEQ's PBR has to be a storage facility that uses electrochemical cells to convert the energy, and it has to be less than 150 megawatts. So those are the two issues, electrochemical cells and less than 150 megawatts. And effective January 1, DEQ issued their permit by rule of this year. And with that, I'll turn it over to Susan to talk about, while we're here, the DEQ permit by rule process.
Great. Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Susan.
Good morning, everybody. Before I get started, I just wanted to let everyone know that Beth Major, who was the manager of the Renewable Energy Permit by Rule program, retired April 1, in case people were wondering what happened there. So we wish Beth well in her future endeavors. And so with that, I'll go ahead and get started. All right. As a quick reminder, what is a permit by rule, or a PBR? Because the program that this regulation falls under is a PBR, just like the others that we have for solar, wind, and combustion. It means that the project is deemed to have a permit if it meets all the requirements that are in the regulation. It provides developers with greater certainty because they know upfront what those requirements are. And ultimately, then the application itself becomes the permit. Next slide. Thank you. As Bob mentioned, House Bill 2148 from the 2021 General Assembly session added energy storage projects up to 150 megawatts to DEQ's PBR process. So what that did is added the definition of an energy storage facility, also amended the definition of a small renewable energy project to include energy storage facilities and hybrid projects. Let's see, energy storage. Effective January 1, the SCC adopted their regulations. Bob already spoke to that. So that was the process that was utilized for energy storage prior to when our regulation became effective January 1 of 2022. And it was promulgated to provide a streamlined method for permitting energy storage projects. And I will say at this point in time, we do not have any permitted energy storage projects. So, won't go over this too much, but you can see a quick history of the PBR programs that we have. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a wind PBR. We have one wind project on the books. Solar, we currently have over 100 permitted solar projects. No combustion, and as I mentioned, nothing yet for renewable energy, but I anticipate that that will change fairly soon. Next slide. The important thing for small energy storage facilities, as far as the permit by rule program goes, when we look at applicability, it's based on the disturbance zone, and that's going to determine which provisions of the regulation would apply to you. So if you'll see a disturbance zone greater than 10 acres, you would comply with Section 30 of the regulation. Anything that's a disturbance zone that's less or equal to 10 acres complies under 130. Due to the nature of energy storage projects, we're anticipating that most of the permits that, or the applications that we will see, will be permitted under Section 130, and we just refer to those as Section 130 permits. Next slide. Real quickly, you can see the definition of a disturbance zone. We're looking at the area within your site that's directly impacted by land disturbing activity, including any construction and operation of the facility, and 100 feet of the boundary of the directly impacted area. Couple other points there about the local government and zoning if you're in an urban area. And then just to note that a hybrid facility is subject to the same requirements as any other small renewable energy project. All right, so we're going to dive into real quickly Section 130. So you can see, if you're familiar with our PBR programs in the various chapters, 60, 70, and 80, and then of course Chapter 100 for energy storage, those all had 15 components to comply. Under Section 130, you can see that there are only 7 requirements here. So our intent was to make this program streamlined and as easy as we possibly could while still complying with the regulations so that folks can get these projects on the books. Let's see, Section 130 also can apply to facilities located on previously disturbed or repurposed areas, so looking at brownfields. And then you can see that facilities with a rated power capacity less than, I can't see the rest of that, that's cut off, 150. You know what, we'll just go on. All right, so Section 30, so remember, this is if your renewable energy battery storage project is over 10 acres, your disturbance zone is over 10 acres. These are the permitting requirements, and you'll see those are pretty much identical to what you have under solar, wind, and combustion, those 15 components. So we won't cover that any further. Next slide. I wanted to point out some of the new provisions that are in the energy storage regulation because they are there are some changes that aren't included in solar, wind, or combustion. So for example, notice of intent. This is a change. It has to be submitted at least 90 days prior to the start of your public comment period. So that's something that you need to be aware of when considering when you want to submit notice of your project. Another change to that as part of the requirement under the notice of intent is that you will need to submit that same notice to the chief administrative officer and the chief elected officer or official of the locality in which your project is proposed. There are some things in here too that if you haven't submitted your application within 48 months, then your NOI will expire. So that is something that is new to this particular program. Next slide. Another thing to mention that is new is there's a cover letter with a document certification that's required. And I'm not going to read the statement to you, but it's on the screen and also, of course, in the regulation. It needs to be signed by a responsible person. And then I also wanted to point out that when you are submitting your application, we also need to know who the responsible individual will be that will be listed on the permit by rule authorization letter. That's the individual that if there were any compliance or enforcement issues would be responsible for that. So it's very important that we have that information and that when you submit your project, you're not just providing us with the name of the LLC. Next slide. Something else. So we talked about the fact that the NOI could expire if we didn't receive an application in a certain period of time. This is new in that once you have your application, or I'm sorry, your permit in hand, it could become invalid if you have not started construction within 60 months from the date of the PBR. Now, that's not to say that an extension can't be granted, and that is something that we would look at on an individual basis. So that's something that you do need to be aware of. If your permit does become invalid, you would need to go through the process again, submit a new notice of intent, application documents, and pay the appropriate fees to reactivate your permit. Next slide. There is, very similar to the requirements for the State Corporation Commission. Oh, nope. Back one more. Yes, thank you. A facility that has a rated power capacity equal to or less than 1 megawatt is not required to submit any notifications or certification to DEQ. Next slide. Thanks. Hybrid projects. So you can see the definition on the screen. It's a small energy storage facility and an electrical generation facility as defined by the PBR for wind, solar, or combustion. So the thing that's that we, as I mentioned before, we try to streamline this. So if you are submitting a hybrid project, which would mean a solar application and then say battery storage simultaneously, we are trying to streamline that so that you could submit one application You will receive 2 permits with 2 permit numbers, but we are streamlining the application process itself. Next slide. One thing to point out, the hybrid facilities are not subject to the small energy storage facility fee. And that is because you would end up paying the fee for whatever renewable energy program that you are applying for. So that would be the solar fee, wind, or combustion. Another point that might be of interest to folks is I wanted to clarify that the rated capacity of your small energy storage portion is not added together. So it's not cumulative. So if you have a 150 megawatt solar project and you have 150 megawatt battery storage, that is allowed under the PBR. So those are separate. So next slide. Questions about, all right, we often receive questions about issuance and timelines for the PBR authorization. And so I want to offer a clarification here in that if you look at the regulation, within 90 days of receiving a complete application, that starts the 90-day window, if you will. So we have that 90 days where we immediately will submit the application materials to our sister agencies for their review and consultation. And then at the end of that 90 days, we would form a determination that your application is complete or not complete. If it's complete, we'll generate a PBR authorization letter. If it's deemed incomplete, we'll notify the applicant in writing of the deficiencies. And I do want to point out that we often, our goal is to not issue incomplete letters. We want to work with you, and during that 90-day window, if there are minor deficiencies, we will work on correcting those so that you can get your PBR within that 90-day window. Next slide. Some things that these are record keeping and reporting requirements that I want to point out. These are also in the other PBRs. Sometimes folks don't seem to be aware of those, so that's why I pulled this out on the slide. So once you received your PBR authorization, there are some records that we need to have after the fact. We need to know when your project began construction. And of course, that will become more important now with energy storage due to the fact that it could potentially become invalid if you haven't started construction. Let's see. We want to know. Date of any on-site construction or maintenance that could impact your project's mitigation and avoidance plan. That is something you need to notify us within 15 days of occurrence. We need your post-construction maps within 90 days of completion of such work. And then for projects that contain mitigation or historic resources, what does that say there, Stephanie?
Post-construction demonstration, mitigation.
Alrighty, within 90 days of completing such work, we need to have that information to submit it to us. So just be aware of those timelines. Those are things that also we get that questions from the general public on a lot, and we tried to provide that information. So we need that from a regulatory perspective, but also this is information the general public is very much interested in. Next slide. I did want to stress that pre-application meetings are encouraged, especially now with this new program. We are happy to meet informally to discuss your project planning and development. It's helpful for us if you have any studies that you've done, if you can send us any site maps so that we can talk through the process. We can meet in person. We can also do Zoom calls. And what I will try to facilitate is to also include the sister agencies, so DCR, DWR, and DHR, so that we can go through your project and answer any questions that you have and really help you get a complete application for submittal. That's our goal. Thank you. All right. With that, I turn it back over to Brad.
Good. Well, thank you, Susan. I think we've got a couple questions that came in. First question is for Bob. Has the State Corporation Commission issued any permits for energy storage projects under the SEC storage rules?
Has the SEC issued any permits?
Correct.
Okay, yes. The answer is yes, they have. The State Corporation Commission issued their rule at the beginning of 2021. The first couple applications came in the spring of 2021, and the commission has issued several permits in late summer, early fall of 2021. So the commission actually has issued several permits. Of course, that was before the PBR was authorized from DEQ on storage. Let me take the next question, guys.
Sure.
All right. There's a question here for Susan. When is it recommended that an applicant submit a notice of intent for a storage project?
We encourage, well, as I pointed out in the slide, there are some caveats now of when you need to do that and the timing of that when you're having your public comment period. So that's 90 days, but we encourage you to submit it before that. That sort of opened up, and we can appreciate the fact that there's timing involved with what you're doing with your financing and things within your own project to manage that process. And because once you do submit an NOI, it does get published out on Town Hall in the Virginia Register, so it does become public record. But that really does open the window for us and for the applicant to work with the sister agencies and answer any questions that they might have at that process. So as soon in the process as you can, whenever you are ready. We've gotten questions before. You don't necessarily have to have your special use permit or conditional use permit in hand. So it just says, if you read in the regulation, I think it's practically reasonable as possible. So that would be my guidance.
Well, like they did too, it opens up the ability to meet with sister agencies and DEQ once you file your notice. Thank you.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Good answer.
Susan, another question for you, and I think you give an answer at the Virginia Solar Summit on this question, so it might be the same answer, but do you have any update on the status of the amendments to the solar PBR regulation?
Yeah, I'll give the same answer that I gave then. My answer is I have no answer. We haven't received any sort of an update on that. There are a lot of things that are going on right now, and I'm sure most people are aware of House Bill 206, which the General Assembly has that's not the right word, has asked DEQ to do a study on prime agricultural farmland and forest. And so we've been pretty busy with that, and we'll soon be kicking that off with an ad hoc group. So for now, I do not have an update on the solar PBR regulation or the amendments.
Okay. All right. We have time for another question? All right, there's another question for Susan. Are there any, this is probably goes into the solar side, but it would probably impact the storage also. But are there any common deficiencies that you might see in a PBR application that, that folks would encounter on the solar side that they might try to avoid on the storage side?
Okay. I think that sometimes what we're seeing, especially on of what needs to occur when, and unfortunately, because it's a plus and a minus having the 15 components and this very prescriptive process. But if those regulations aren't followed, then it could also mean that an applicant might have to potentially redo their public notification or their 30-day participation because things weren't available to the general public, because those materials have to be available, or perhaps there were deficiencies in the material. So that's something that folks need to be aware of when they're doing the process using the PBR. I think the other thing would be is I just encourage folks to really look at the regulation and to make sure that you have really touched on every single component. And if you are unsure about the interpretation of that, to please give me a call. I would be happy to discuss that with you to make sure that you are complying with that. So I'll just leave it at that.
That's good, yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
That's good.
Susan, just to carry on, I think you might have talked a little bit in your presentation, but the question is, can you generally describe the process once a PBR application, either solar or storage, is submitted to DEQ? What departments are involved?
Okay. So when we receive an application, It is immediately forwarded to the Department of Historic Resources, the Department of Wildlife Resources, and the Department of Conservation and Recreation. Because if you look in the regulation, there's that component of the various analyses that need to be done for the review of historic resources, wildlife, and natural resources. We also send that to the regional office in which the potential site is located for them to do review. I do want to point out that I do submit the information to our stormwater construction program just so that they are aware that we've received the application. But I'm assuming most of the folks on this webinar realize that that's a separate permitting program within DEQ. So that review goes out, and generally they have about 30 days to do that. It comes back in, and then we go through and analyze and look at what was returned to compare that with what we received, and if there were any sort of mitigation measures that were not found initially, then those are things that we would need to address. And so, that's pretty much the process.
Yeah.
We're just, once I get the review back from the sister agencies, I go through and evaluate the components and just make sure that everything that's in the regulation has been complied with. So sometimes it takes the full 90 days. Just because we have a lot of applications and one person. However, I am pleased to announce that hopefully very shortly in the next month, we will be hiring another PBR coordinator to assist in the program. So that should help alleviate.
We love announcements, right?
And I don't want to leave out Chris Egghart, who's also in the permit by rule program. He recently joined us. He's been with the agency, but he is officially now in the air and renewable energy program. And he coordinates with the Department of Historic Resources. And so most folks have probably worked with Chris, super smart gentleman. And he is also going to be coordinating compliance and enforcement efforts as we go forward with this program. So.
More questions? Do we have time? Do we have time for one more? So
Yeah.
Can you?
I can try to handle one more.
Okay,
sure.
one more question.
All righty.
I'm being told one more question. Let me pick a
Make
good
it
one.
easy.
Let me try back.
Let's make it easy. All right.
All right. Let's see. I'll pick this one. I don't know if it's easier
All
or
right.
what. What documents should an applicant make available to the public for review during the public review period?
Okay, good question. They need to, so the point of the public notification and participation process is, there's the 30-day public comment period, but those materials, if you look in the regulation, are required to be placed in vicinity or in the locality where the project is going to be sited. That's to give the public the opportunity to go and look through those documents. And it's really all the documentation that you would be submitting to DEQ as part of your application. So that could be something, once again, if there turned out to be mitigation and you didn't have a mitigation plan drafted and available for the public, potentially you could need to do the 30-day public comment period over again. So that is the intent of that, is to have everything available that supports your application. And it should be all the same materials that you would be submitting to DEQ.
Good. That was great. Good. Very good question. Great answer. I think that's the last one, right? That's the last one we have.
Yeah, there's some others that I don't think you have time for, but we'll respond after the webinar to those. So I want to thank everybody for attending, and certainly want to thank our special guest, Susan Tripp with DEQ, and Bob. Appreciate
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
And if you've got any other questions or would like to be added to our mailing list, feel free to email us at solar@williamsmullen.com. And once again, thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at our last webinar of the series on June 2nd.